Hearing will now come to order. Welcome to the Budget Committee's first in a series of hearings that will focus on economic growth and its impact on our nation's fiscal health and future prosperity. I will yield myself such time as I may consume for an opening statement. I have promised my colleague Brendan Boyles and my Democrat friends that I will not go 12 minutes this time. Is that okay with you, Jimmy? We're going to shoot for 14 and set a record. Today, we are starting this series on how we as a committee and as a Congress can contribute to reigniting American growth and prosperity. If we're going to bring down inflation and interest rates along with it, lift our economy out of recession, strengthen our nation's balance sheet, and stave off a debt crisis, I believe we have to do two primary things. We've got to reduce spending and grow the economy. That's the strategy that's worked in the past. That's the formula for success, I believe, to get us out of our current economic and financial mess. And that's the framework for our current debt ceiling proposal. Rein in spending, right-size the bloated bureaucracy where we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars more than even what the nonpartisan CBO said we'd be spending at this juncture. And return to pro-growth, pro-work, pro-energy policies that will unleash American prosperity once again. Today's hearing will focus on the economic growth part of this equation, and with $32 trillion of debt, 123% gross debt to GDP, the prospect of another $20 trillion or more added to the debt in 10 years, an annual deficit set to double, and interest payments, which we got a report on recently from CBO that will increase at least 40% year over year for this year at $663 billion just to service the debt, almost, well, over 3/4 of what we spend on all of national defense. If we grow the economy while controlling spending, we can create a glide path to a healthier balance sheet, a stronger economy, and a brighter future. Policies have consequences. I think we can all agree with that. I would submit to you that the reckless spending and the failed economic policies of the last 2 years have been disastrous. Higher taxes, an onslaught of regulations, which will be our focus today, an expansion of welfare without work, a whole of government assault on the lifeblood of our economy, American energy, and a whopping $10 trillion in spending, an unprecedented $6 trillion of which has been added to the national debt in just 2 years. Today, we're going to focus on the burden of excessive and overreaching regulations, how they kill jobs, suppress growth, reduce wages, and increase cost to consumers. Look, I used to work at the FDIC as chief of staff. I understand we need reasonable and limited rules for fair competition and consumer protection, basic safeguards for health and safety, but by congressional abdication and/or executive activism, we've created a Frankenstein of a fourth branch of government and a massive regulatory state that is compromising our freedoms, quenching our entrepreneurial spirit as a nation, and choking the life out of our economy. And I don't think that's hyperbolic. I think that may even be an understatement, and we'll dig into that today. The Code of the Federal Regulations now contains more than 1.3 million separate regulatory restrictions and costs on our economy of trillions of dollars. The cumulative effect of this seemingly infinite set of rules and regulations is devastating, to say the least, to our economy, our global competitiveness, and ultimately our quality of life as Americans. The Mercatus Center found that if regulations had remained at 1980 levels, GDP in 2012 would have been $4 trillion higher, and real incomes would be higher by $13,000 per person. I respect that President Trump took this on, I think, like no other president, this Herculean task of deregulating our economy, and I believe he had great success, and there was great reward for all Americans as a result. Instead of piling on more rules, his goal was to eliminate 8 regulations for every new regulation enacted, which ultimately saved consumers and job creators more than $220 billion per year. President Biden, on the other hand, has unleashed unprecedented barrage of regulations and executive actions at a record clip. All told, his administration has added $360 billion in new regulatory cost on our economy, and he's on pace to double in 4 years the cost of the Obama White House in their regulations over 8 years. It's not just the economic cost of hurting our country, it's the circumvention, and I hope we can all agree with this because I'm certain both parties have contributed to this by abusing their executive authority. They've circumvented our democratic process to make policy whole cloth outside of the constitutional legislative process and against the will of the American people as a result. Advancing policies by regulatory fiat that could never pass the United States Congress undermines popular sovereignty and is an affront to our self-determination. Recent examples include expanding government dependency by executive fiat, pushing people by the hundreds of thousands onto Obamacare who already have work-sponsored health insurance, removing work requirements for able-bodied adults, allowing millions of people who are ineligible to stay on Medicaid rolls, forcing low-income families to pay for student loans of upper and middle-income individuals. The president has unilaterally used rules and regulations to target an entire industry, something in my lifetime I've never seen. Shutting down power plants, shaking down federal contractors for information about emissions, dictating what cars and trucks that Americans can buy and even what kind of stoves we can use. Getting rid of these needless and burdensome red tape and regulations will take a sustained effort. I welcome the input and collaboration from my Democrat friends. But if we don't reverse course, the greatest economy in the world will die a death of 1,000 regulatory cuts, and our children will not inherit the land of opportunity, but a desolate economy, a barren land, a bankrupt country, and a very bleak future. And with that, Rosie, an optimistic scenario, I yield to my friend, Mr. Boyle from Pennsylvania, for his opening statement, such time as he may consume.
Well, thank you. And Jodey, as folks know, is a friend of mine. But I have to tell him, after listening to that depressing assessment, I wouldn't even want to wake up in the morning. Oh, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. Thank God it isn't true. Here's the reality. The greatest economic recovery from COVID of any major economy on earth is that of the United States of America. An unemployment rate today, the lowest it's been since 1969. We are the envy of the world right now. And even inflation, which we all admit has been a challenge. No, it was not transitory, as Jay Powell kept telling us. But even that, the remarkable progress in the United States, 9 consecutive months, inflation has dropped. We have a better inflation picture here in the United States than all of our peer countries in Europe, as well as the average of OECD nations. In fact, if anything, it's getting a little bit worse in some of those major economies in Europe, while the United States, it continues to improve. Just 2 hearings ago, not you, but sitting in that chair was Mark Zandi, the chief economist of Moody's, who told us in this hearing room that by late 2024, we should be back to normal in that 2% range on inflation, which of course was caused not by any domestic legislation in the United States. It wasn't anything that passed here that caused inflation worldwide. It was, of course, turning the spigot back on, essentially, after COVID. So this has been a remarkable period for our economy, a resilience that even the experts at the Congressional Budget Office, and I respect them all and the important work that they do on a nonpartisan basis, but this has far exceeded their best expectations. They didn't think we would return to an unemployment rate this low for the rest of the decade. So let's make sure we do not do anything in Congress to jeopardize this remarkable record of the last 2.5 years. So the good news is that there is no reason for this sort of pessimism and doom and gloom. We should be talking about ways that we can sustain this growth while at the same time acknowledging that, particularly as we look at the projections for the next decade, the national debt is a challenge. Now let's just talk about spending for a second. You know, it's interesting to hear the other side talk a good game about spending and national debt. They had full power just 5 years ago. 5, 6 years ago, 2017, 2018, Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate. And what did they do? Increase spending. And what happened to the deficit? The biggest single jump in the deficit in a growing economy in American history, all as a result of the TCJA, the Trump tax cuts. The tax cuts, 83% of which went to the richest 1%. So forgive me if I'm a little skeptical that those on the other side are now so concerned about deficit and debt. Although I will exempt, actually, our chairman from this. To his credit, in a bipartisan fashion, he has pointed out that, frankly, spending has increased under both sides when in charge. The difference is on the revenue side. The difference is when Democrats have been in charge, we have attempted to tackle deficit and debt by ensuring that we receive more, frankly, a fair share from the richest 1%. But when the other side is in charge, they do not have that same approach. In fact, even now, when the conversation is taking place about reducing deficit and reducing debt, there are those on the other side that are pushing to make the Trump tax cuts permanent, which would add $3.5 trillion more to the national debt. So give me a break. There's no concern about deficit and debt on the vast majority of those on the other side. They just want to continue the massive tax giveaways to the top 1% and the richest corporations. And they are willing to use the excuse of deficit and debt to cut important investments that so many of the American people benefit from. Finally, I will say, because trying to stay within the time limit, some of the things that are being talked about right now and that actually passed the House a few weeks ago in the Republican bill would have a devastating impact on our economy. You don't have to believe any Democratic talking points. Just look at the nonpartisan analysis from Moody's. 800,000 fewer jobs by the end of next year if their bill were to become law. A substantially increased risk of a recession if their bill would become law. And all sorts of individual cuts that I recited last session, and will be happy to repeat later, again, if we get the opportunity in this hearing. So that, in a nutshell, is where we stand right now in our economy. We need to stand up and continue those policies that have worked, and the last thing we need to do is to pursue any policies that would jeopardize this remarkable job record. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and regret yielding him as much time as he may consume. In all seriousness, welcome. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your time, every one of you. Look forward to your contributions to this important discussion, and want to introduce our witnesses. We start with Doug Holtz-Egan, a friend and no stranger to the Ways and Means Committee in testifying over the years. He's the president of American Action Forum. We also have Ms. Karen Harned, president of Harned Strategies. Mr. Wayne Cruz, Fred Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. The Honorable Benjamin Harris, former Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Thanks again for your time. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and I now yield 5 minutes to Dr. Holtz-Egan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the committee. It's a privilege to be here today. Let me make 4 very brief points, and then I look forward to answering your questions. Point number 1 is that I think we would all agree that the U.S. could benefit from more rapid economic growth. If you look at GDP per capita, a crude measure of the standard of living, we saw GDP per capita grow at an average rate of 2.3% per year in the final 50 years of the 20th century. And at that pace of economic growth, the standard of living doubles every 30 years. So in one working career, the standard of living could double, and that was many people's route to the American dream, the additional resources that yielded. So far in this century, we've averaged GDP growth per capita of 1.2% per year. And at that pace, The standard of living doubles every 58 years, nearly twice as long. And there's the palpable sense that access to the American dream is disappearing over the horizon. It's a concern for Americans interested in sending their kids to college, buying a house, and having all the benefits of a growing economy. Going forward, there's reason for concern. If the CBO projections are accurate, we'll grow at under 1% in GDP per capita over the next 10 years, and the pace of doubling of the standard of living will decline even further. So there are really two important points about that. Number one, it would be great to grow more rapidly. Number two, the trend rate of growth in the economy is not some constant delivered by nature. It's responsive to policies, to tax policies, regulatory policies, labor market policies, and focusing on the growth impact of policies makes a lot of sense at this point in time. Second point is that among the policies that's varied over time is the regulatory costs in the United States. And using the data from American Action Forum's Reg Rodeo, which is curated by Dan Goldbeck, who's sitting right there, we track the cost of regulations issued by all the agencies in the federal government, and we have data going back to 2005 to do this. If you look at that data, we saw regulatory costs imposed on the private sector of an average of $120 billion roughly per year under the Obama administration, fell to about $15 billion per year under the Trump administration, and at current pace, it's roughly $150 billion a year under the Biden administration. Indeed, the first year of the Biden administration exceeded $200 billion, the largest single first year of any president in our data. Clearly, these regulatory costs are something that they can be moved up and down, and we ought to think about how do we want them to progress going forward. As I cite in my testimony, there's lots of research literature that suggests that excessive regulatory costs can be a headwind to economic growth. From recent experience, I think we should have some reason for concern about excessive costs, because one of the reasons we had such a slow recovery from the Great Recession was, in fact, the $890 billion of cumulative regulatory costs imposed on the economy under the 8 years of the Obama administration. And with the arrival of the Trump administration, we saw just a real change in both the regulatory costs and the outlook in the economy. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, small business confidence index jumped overnight with the arrival of that regime. So the final point is that Congress, I think, should think hard about imposing some structure on the regulatory state and controlling excessive costs through one strategy or another. And there are really three strategies outlined in my testimony. One is essentially to enhance the current Congressional Review Act, which looks after the fact at regulations and attempts to repeal them. And instead, for major regulations, the Congress could approve in advance and screen things before they get too large. The second approach is to have a commission to look at the entire existing body of regulations and weed out those which no longer serve any great purpose and or are excessively expensive. That's something that is in something called the Scrub Act, which has been considered by Congress in the past. And the third option is to adopt a statutory version of the Trump administration's regulatory budgets, which essentially said to an agency, you can impose this much in costs on the private sector this year, and if you have proposed a regulation that exceeds that budget, you have to find a saving elsewhere. This is a budget committee. That's a strategy that ought to appeal to everyone sitting in this room as a way to set the targets and coordinate the activities across all the agencies and eliminate the potential for excessive regulation because people are not cognizant of the cumulative costs across the entire range of government activities. So I think this is a very important topic. I'm pleased to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Holtz-Egan. And now I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Ms. Harned for her testimony.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Boyle and members of the committee. For over 25 years, I have worked as an attorney in administrative law, and over the last 20, I have worked on behalf of small business, first at NFIB and now on behalf of Job Creators Network. Over my career, I have watched as federal agencies have grown their power to not just administer the law, but to make it. Agency officials appear to treat many of the laws governing rulemaking as box-checking exercises rather than meaningful processes to ensure transparency in how rules are made and protect against new regulations having unintended consequences on businesses and ultimately the American people. Federal regulations cost the U.S. economy real money, and the cost for small businesses is disproportionately higher than it is for the large ones. While at NFIB, as Doug mentioned, I witnessed one of the clearest pictures of the correlation between regulations and the economy during the presidential transition from 2016 to 2017. In 2012, experts predicted the coming of a regulatory tsunami. That prediction came to pass in 2016 with the record-setting 97,110 pages of new regulations in the Federal Register. Small business optimism at that time was at historically low levels, according to NFIB. However, then candidate Trump promised that if elected, he would work to reduce the regulation and eliminate unnecessary regulations on the books. Following his election, NFIB's monthly survey of small businesses showed a sharp rise in business optimism starting in January 2017, a trend that continued until COVID. During the regulatory ramp-up of the Obama administration, the small businesses I spoke with expressed concern about what was coming out of Washington. Many could point to specific regulations, but others seemed just paralyzed by the volume. They did not know how these regulations were going to impact their business. They just knew a large number were in the works. The uncertainty caused by such government regulatory expansion was a significant factor in their decisions not to grow their business. My conversations with small business owners and what they were experiencing mirrored what NFIB's research showed. First, the cost of complying with regulation is the biggest problem for small business. According to Job Creators Network's monthly SBIQ poll, 79% of small businesses have fewer than 10 employees. In the regulatory context, this is particularly important to appreciate. Firms with fewer than 10 employees do not employ attorneys, accountants, or human resource professionals. In fact, they're lucky if they even have a sales manager. As a practical matter, that means it is the small business owner who is tasked with those duties, including many of which are regulatory compliance. So in 2016, it's not surprising to hear that over 41% of those small business owners surveyed reported reaching out to talk with someone at a government agency to get help in complying with the regulation over the last 3 years. Time is money. Time spent filling out paperwork, keeping up with new regulations, and in many cases, hiring a lawyer or other outside professional to help, like an accountant, to help navigate the regulatory jungle is time and money not spent investing in and growing the business. Second, the volume of regulations, rather than a few specific regulations, is the biggest problem for 55% of businesses. Unless a business owner is in a highly technical or regulated industry, the regulatory burden they experience is more generalized. It's the famous death by 1,000 cuts, or for the small business owner, death by 1,000 regulations. Unfortunately, it appears that the Biden administration is ushering in a new regulatory tsunami. As a result, small business owners are growing increasingly concerned about the economy and their ability to succeed. According to a recent Job Creators Network poll, 74% of small businesses rate the economy as fair or poor. As the poll notes in its takeaways, the small business community thinks we are close to a recession. The good news is there are several House bills I highlight in my testimony that I think would go a long way in ensuring agencies are held accountable when they overstep their authority, not engaging in one-size-fits-all rulemaking that is particularly harmful to small business, and reviewing the thousands of regulations on the books to ensure that what I call the regulatory underbrush is eliminated. Federal regulation has a direct impact on the economy. Businesses large and small consider regulation when deciding where to locate and whether to expand. Congress should pursue legislation that would help rein in the regulatory state. Thank you for having me testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Now we yield 5 minutes to you for your testimony.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the Budget Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Wayne Cruz, and I am the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization focused on regulatory issues from a free market perspective. Federal spending gets all the attention, but the hidden tax of regulation is equally important. The Code of Federal Regulations is 188,000 pages and counting. Regulations affect nearly every aspect of life, from our houses we live in, to the food we eat, to what we do at work. Recent proposed White House changes in an already opaque rulemaking process will make regulation even less transparent. For example, members of the committee may be unaware that there's been no formal OMB report to Congress on regulatory costs and benefits since 2020, covering fiscal year 2019. Only a relative handful of regulations receive rigorous analysis. Independent agencies, ascendant in Biden's whole-of-government progressive pursuits like climate crisis, equity, and competition policy, get little OMB scrutiny, nor do the thousands of guidance documents, memoranda, circulars, notices, and other decrees that we refer to as regulatory dark matter. Bottom line, nothing exists to justify claims of net benefits for the entire regulatory enterprise, especially since unmeasured categories of intervention, such as antitrust, propel cost as well. Notwithstanding all this, at Biden's direction, OMB is reformatting central regulatory review procedures through a rewrite of so-called Circular A4 guidance on regulatory analysis. This is problematic given the progressive transformation and federal consolidations underway in the United States. When government steers cross-sectionally as it does today while the market merely rose, especially in the wake of Inflation Reduction Act and other recent control-oriented spending bills, it creates compounding costs of intervention even if no specific notice and comments rules get issued. Comprehensive regulatory reform is important. Congress, as for example recently the RSC GEAR, Government Efficiency, Accountability, and Reform Task Force noted, has vastly over-delegated power to these administrative agencies. While Congress tends to pass a few dozen laws each year, up to a couple of hundred, maybe 300, agencies issue over 3,000 rules. So it's a good thing that the REINS Act to require congressional approval of certain hefty rules appears in the debt limit package. Today's hearing, though, proves that there is an appetite in the 118th Congress for reforms, and we do periodically see bipartisan appeals for transparency and better disclosure of regulatory burdens. Some might not realize that the 118th Congress's Regulatory Accountability Act, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act, a Regulatory Improvement Commission, and even regulatory budgeting boast bipartisan pedigree. I discussed these and more in my written testimony. Speaking of regulatory budgeting, Representative Bob Good's Article I Regulatory Budget Act would make Washington's presence in the economy more explicit by capping what agencies individually and collectively compel the private sector to spend on compliance. More thorough cost analysis and more transparency are bipartisan winners. A generation ago, the Unfunded Mandates Act, the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, and shockingly enough, the Congressional Review Act, the very CRA that generates so much consternation now, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, with Harry Reid among those leading the charge. Unfunded mandates reform was so popular it was dubbed S1 in the Senate. If, as I suspect is likely, a rise in mandates on lower-level governments and small business materializes, reform may again garner bipartisan appeal. It certainly enjoys constituent appeal. That said, mere regulatory reform won't suffice if Congress continues enacting hyper-legislation like that of recent years, a series of transformations that are fusing the spending and regulatory state into a colossus, much of it propelled by the federal government's extraordinary and monopolistic procurement and contracting power. Overdoing regulation and legislation will derail our post-pandemic march into an era of renewed prosperity. When it comes to healthy and prolonged economic expansion, you don't need to tell the grass to grow, but you do have to take the rocks off of it. Thank you again for inviting me to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Now we want to yield 5 minutes to Dr. Harris for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify at this important hearing today. I'm honored to appear before this committee to discuss strategies to grow the American economy. Given the broad and far-reaching focus of this hearing, my written testimony outlines 4 key lessons for policymakers who seek to implement policies and reforms aimed at promoting economic prosperity in a sustainable and inclusive way. First, I believe we need a new framework for generating economic growth. In January 2022, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen introduced a new theory for economic growth termed modern supply-side economics. Secretary Yellen presented a pro-growth strategy as an alternative to supply-side economics that could better boost potential GDP and lead to faster annual gains in growth. A key part of the modern supply-side approach is policy reforms designed to lower barriers to work and increase the labor force participation rate, while a second pillar aims to address the negative implications of economic shocks, including the increasing disruptions from climate-related events like hurricanes, flooding, and persistent drought. A second lesson is that robust competition is necessary to harness the power of capitalism, and targeted regulation can help. Competition is an essential element of capitalism, and lack of competition often impedes the ability of markets to deliver their full economic potential. Perhaps contrary to the central takeaways of traditional supply-side economics, more robust regulation in certain circumstances, including in particular the labor market, can improve competition and lead to more efficient economic outcomes. Especially, policy interventions are important to combating monopsony-like conditions that can arise due to a host of factors, including employer concentration, anti-competition policies like non-compete agreements, and asymmetric information regarding compensation, among others. A third, especially timely lesson is that failure to raise the debt limit is a pressing and serious threat to economic growth. The current debt limit impasse represents a serious threat to economic growth and will likely result in a severe economic disruption if not resolved in a timely fashion. Reputable analysis from organizations such as Moody's and the Brookings Institution have confirmed that breaching the debt ceiling would have severe and perhaps catastrophic economic consequences. To elaborate on these threats in the context of the current impasse, there are four major avenues through which the debt limit can cause economic harm. The first is through brinksmanship prior to the X date, which we have already begun to observe in financial markets. A second major threat is through a financial crisis owing to a post-X date impasse in which the Treasury Department defaults, failing to make a scheduled payment, or even missing a principal or interest payment on Treasury securities. The third major threat is related to potential political remedies to resolve the current impasse, including a sharp reduction in discretionary spending. A final concern is related to the repeal of tax incentives for clean energy production implemented through the Inflation Reduction Act, which would not only undermine planned projects in the energy sector, but would cast uncertainty around the permanence of all tax incentives previously enacted by Congress. The fourth and final lesson is that the revolution in energy production will be a major boost to growth in economies that choose to compete in this market. The world is in the midst of a massive transition in the way energy is consumed and especially produced. The transition promises a series of economic, social, and health benefits that rival some of the greatest achievements in human history, principally related to the gains achieved by mitigating the harmful impacts of carbon emissions. Yet, even laying aside the gains from reducing emissions, the transition promises to offer a major macroeconomic advantage to those countries that invest in low-carbon technologies. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I yield 5 minutes for the beginning of our Q&A session to myself. And let me play off something, Dr. Harris, that you said about competition. I agree. Healthy competition is good for the economy, for our free enterprise system. But when I hear Ms. Harned's comments about small businesses and the disproportionate impact of regulations, and representing West Texas and a big rural swath of the Lone Star State, most of the job creators are family farmers and independent oil and gas producers and small businesses of all kinds. And they tell me about this tremendous weight of all the red tape and all the compliance cost on their businesses. They talk about, though, the sort of combination of so many things. Unemployment numbers look good, but job participation numbers look bad. We still have millions of people that are not in the workforce that were there pre-COVID. NFIB also had a study where half of their small business members said they can't fully staff up. So there is a labor shortage. I would say it's at least the tail of paying people not to work and welfare without work requirements. I think we need to tighten them up because that's a big gap and a big drag on the economy. And I think small businesses, that's one of the layers in addition to the regulatory cost. Obviously, capital costs with interest rates and a number of things. But let's talk about the competitive disadvantage of the job creation engine of America's small businesses. Any comments on that, Ms. Harned?
Yes, I mean, the struggle is real. And a lot of it's because, small businesses really don't have a good seat at the table at all these, regulatory inner workings. Groups like NFIB and job creators can only do so much. They do not have their individual Washington rep offices roaming the halls of EPA. So what I still find is, despite all of our best efforts on their behalf, many don't know about a regulation until they're forced to comply with it, and they're like, where'd this come from? How do I, comply with this? Again, 40% are calling the government to try to figure out how to comply. So they are already at a disadvantage when it comes to that. And I also just have to remark that I would agree with your comment on getting folks in the workplace. JCN, Job Creators, is showing the same issue, and in fact, surveyed on the limit, save, grow and the work requirement, and 80 or more percent wanted to see that happen.
Well, on top of the input cost and the regulatory burden and the labor shortage, just so that people don't think I'm trying to be pessimistic in a vacuum or for political purposes, I would suggest a 1.1 GDP quarter last quarter, which is down every quarter for the last 3 quarters, heading into recession, ain't good news. So, look, there are a number of things that will benefit this country with respect to growth. And I've got a minute and a half left. I just want to list a few, and then Doug, I'd like you to elaborate on this because we've got to strengthen the balance sheet. We have a debt problem that could turn quickly into a debt crisis. That would be hard to bail. You can't print money and borrow enough to bail out of a debt crisis. Seems to me, though, that a stronger economy would strengthen the balance sheet by generating revenue to the Treasury, improve our ability to pay our bills and our nation's priorities, reduce the financial risk, which would lower interest payments, which would bring down our debt to GDP, et cetera, et cetera. How important is this growth factor in our ability as a nation, collectively, Democrat and Republican, to get our country on good financial footing in the long run? And I'll let you finish the remainder of my time.
Well, certainly, it's important to every family to have greater opportunity and see the real wages rising and have their standard of living rise. But from the perspective of the fiscal challenge we face, in the end, the revenue bases of the federal government are going to grow roughly as fast as nominal GNP. And so if we get back to 2% inflation and we manage to have 2% growth, it's going to grow at 4%. And we have programs, Social Security is growing over 7%, Medicare is growing in the 6s. That gap is enormous, and that's the balance sheet problem. That's the future deficit problem.
Doug, with 5 seconds,
Grow faster.
Can we get to 1%
Grow
more?
faster, add another percentage point of growth, and you've narrowed that gap. You've made everything easier that this committee is worried about.
Do you think we could get 1% growth over that 10-year projection of CBO if we changed the mix of policies in place today?
Congress has never been disciplined enough to do the things necessary
But
for 1%,
if we were.
but it could be done.
Now, there's some optimism, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, and now I yield 5 minutes for Q&A to my colleague.
Well, thank you. And I was remiss earlier, I should point out, most importantly, we have an alumnus from the House Budget Committee staff in Dr. Harris. So welcome back, showing that alumni from this committee go on to do excellent things. So you're very welcome, and thank you for being here. Just a general observation before I do switch to what really is the 800-pound or perhaps more elephant in the room, and that is the greatest threat to our economy that we're facing right now, and that is a failure to raise the debt ceiling. But first, a general observation. One of the reasons why spending always goes up, regardless of the party in the White House or Congress, is that I observe the American people are against spending in the abstract. But then when you poll and ask each individual item that government spends on, there is solid majority support. And that reality is not going to change anytime soon. I think similarly when it comes to regulation, If you ask the American people, if you ask me, what do you think about too much regulation or onerous regulation? We all say, of course we don't want that. We don't like regulation. But then the moment something goes wrong because there wasn't sufficient regulation, people are immediately outraged. And so I think that we as lawmakers, as people who impact public policy, we should probably acknowledge that sort of external constraint that we all operate under in terms of sentiment. Now, switching to the debt ceiling, Dr. Holtz-Aiken, you gave comments in January, which I appreciated, and I'm going to paraphrase, but I think I have it right. It's your view that we should absolutely not play around with the debt ceiling and take it hostage, that it should be increased, but the fights that were happening right now in terms of spending next year and beyond should more appropriately be handled as part of the appropriations process. Is that a fair characterization?
My view is that it is an imperative to, in a timely fashion, raise the debt ceiling or suspend it. That requires 218 votes in the House, 60 in the Senate, and that you're better at than me. So I don't know what piece of legislation gets it done, but please get it done quickly.
Thank you. And Dr. Harris, could you talk about what happened in 2011, the impact of coming so perilously close? I had been saying since January, it was very much my fear and candidly my belief that this would be the most dangerous situation that we would face in terms of the debt ceiling since 2011. Unfortunately, that is proving accurate.
So I would agree with you that is proving accurate. Unfortunately, 2011 was a perfect test case as far as how bad things could get if you fly too close to the sun. Equities declined by 17%, so the stock market went down by 17%. Credit markets...
Including 5% in one day, I think.
In one day. I mean, this is not a typical well-functioning financial system when you're seeing these really big swings day to day. It's bad for business. Credit markets seized up. If you wanted to get a mortgage, it was much more expensive. If you were a big corporation and you were relying on short-term debt markets, as many big corporations do, those markets seized up. The VIX, which is a measure of financial volatility, went through the roof. So, this was a completely unforced manufactured crisis, and we didn't actually hit the debt ceiling. I mean, that was just representative of what could happen. So I'm just as worried as you are.
Yeah, and of course, we ended up, one of the three credit agencies downgraded the United States for the first time ever. There is every indication that we may be about to experience the same thing. Could you opine or offer any insight into the fact that now that the debt ceiling, which has existed for more than a century, but it's really only the last 25 years this has been weaponized, if this dysfunction continues and continues, what impact might that have on the United States continuing to be the reserve currency of the world?
So the United States has benefited from decades and decades of proving to be the best place in the world to do business. We respect the rule of law. We're generally measured when it comes to policy making, and there aren't wild swings and things like the debt ceiling. But we sacrifice that. We sacrifice that, as you said, from a reserve currency standpoint. We also sacrifice that from a policymaking standpoint. And the part about the bill that passed the House that worries me so much is the repeal of the tax credits that were offered in the IRA. I spent a lot of time at Treasury talking to business leaders who relied on those tax credits. They made investments based on that tax credit. They took Congress at its word when it passed the IRA, and to have those pulled out from underneath its feet would be catastrophic to their business decisions.
And with 1 second left, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from South Carolina, Ralph Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we live in two different universes. To hear my friend on the opposite side say it's a rosy picture, the economy's well. Dr. Harris, to hear you say Janet Yellen's got a plan. You talk about the debt ceiling, how we got to raise it. Jodey just mentioned we got $660 billion in interest alone. That's going to surpass our military budget. You've got to face it at some point. Now, my friends on the other aisle saying, we use it as leverage. We're using it to bring some sanity back in this government. Janet Yellen has never created a job in her life. That's the problem up here. You got bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats making policy and spending. It's easy to spend other people's money. I'm in the construction field. We've built many houses and projects. Go ask them on Main Street, the challenges they face. Go ask them why they can't get workers. If a job is hot, you can't find somebody. Go ask them why they can't get meters and the supply chain shortages. I mean, the list goes on and on. I've never seen a battery-operated dump truck. Maybe I haven't looked long enough, but I've just never seen one. I've never seen an 18-wheeler operate on batteries, nor do I get on an airplane and fly out on batteries. Yet this administration thinks that all of a sudden we can have a magic change and go to electric vehicles. The public doesn't want it. And, you know, it's really bizarre. And the fact that we spent, I think it's $400 million on climate change, or maybe billions. You know, can we really control a storm and an earthquake, yet we can't control the price of gas? It's pretty simple, folks. This is stupidity at its height. And the economy is not doing well. I'm part of it. So goes housing, so goes the economy. And the only way we're going to have to get some sanity back is just what we're doing on the debt ceiling. We're putting parameters on what we presented. We got the 218 votes, Dr. Holtz-Eaton, and hopefully we're going to stick with that and not vary from that. Is it unfair to ask people before they get a government check to go to work, go 20 hours a week? Really? So it's really insanity. And I know the Trump administration, aside from so many great things they did, for every regulation that was presented, you had to cut two. And I'd go down the line, what effect did that do with the economy? And I got 2 minutes, just briefly. What dollar amount did that bring to the economy, in your opinion?
If you go from averaging $120 billion a year in regulatory costs imposed on the private sector to 15, you just freed up $105 billion to pay workers better, expand your business, otherwise grow.
So substantial. Yes.
Right. I mean, again, I watched this real time. The small business owners I represented were just, you know, they felt like they could grow again. They felt like Washington wasn't coming with something new that they wouldn't know what it was and what they would have to, you know, new regulatory requirements. It really did help.
It was easier at first to cut more regulations for every regulation that had to be added. It gets a little more difficult, but this notion of cutting rules and in order to add a rule is a bipartisan one. I think it's something we can stress later on when we talk this, and I think it belongs in the discussion that this committee has because it has a big impact, because when you freeze regulation, which is essentially what that was, that Trump 1 in, 2 out was a zero-based regulatory budget, freezing costs. When small business has some certainty, it makes it easier for them to react and to grow and not expect they're going to be hit with something from.
No, and like Ms. Harnett said, most of this, 70-some% of small businesses are made up of 10 people or less. They don't have the funds to hire accountants, to hire the legal fees. And that's what we're hitting all over this country. Dr. Harris?
About the question about general regulation, sir?
Whatever.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I agree with the ranking member. It's very difficult to talk about regulation in the abstract. I've seen firsthand, I've done 3 stints in the administrative branch. I've seen firsthand dedicated.
Let me ask you, I'm running out of time. Is it abstract, or is the interest, how much was it, Jodey? $660 billion on interest of the debt. Is that in the abstract, or is that real?
That's real, and
Okay.
I worry about continued higher spending, but I think, you know, have suggestions for how to improve the fiscal outlook.
Okay, well, it starts with a bill, which is hopefully what we've got. Thank you each for being here. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from South Carolina. You have 5 minutes to Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harris, just, you know, there's a lot of talk, particularly this week, about the debt and the possibility of a default, which, you know, according to a report by NPR, you know, people impacted by default would be U.S. military veterans. $12 billion as of June 1st, if we default. $12 billion in veterans benefits would not be sent out. $12 billion in civilian and retiree benefits would not be sent out. As of June 1st, $25 billion in Social Security benefits would not be sent out. Mortgage interest rates would increase by 8.4%, excuse me. $47 billion in Medicare provider payments that are due June 1st would not go out. $1 billion in tax refunds as of June 7th would not go out. $4 billion in federal salaries would not be paid. Obviously, and the economy would be projected to contract by about 5% and a loss of several 100,000 jobs. The U.S. debt is often misperceived as being owned by foreigners, where actually 70% of U.S. debt is to the American people, owed to the American people. It seems to me that historically, in times of world and domestic financial crisis, the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds and bills increases dramatically because U.S. debt is considered a flight to safety. So in times of economic uncertainty, both for the American people and for the world economy, U.S. debt's kind of a good thing. Why is it so vilified when, in fact, it's deemed to be the safest asset in the world, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States? Can you reconcile those?
So I agree wholeheartedly that we have benefited from U.S. debt being seen as a risk-free asset. And in fact, our financial system, not just the United States, but the world, is based on this. And what I worry about so much about the current debt ceiling impasse is we're on the cusp of possibly seeing the world view U.S. debt as going from risk-free to being a risky asset. And we don't know the implications for that. And you could have a repricing of really every asset in the country, not just Treasury debt, but also every home, every piece of stock that you own, every investment that you make. I mean, we could just be throwing an incredible match on gasoline right now as we see Treasuries go from risk-free assets to being risky assets. We just don't know what would happen. It's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, our friends on the other side are, very quick to point to the fact that they don't want to adversely impact Social Security, for example. So right now, there's a Social Security trust fund of $2.8 trillion. As I understand it, that's the money that is paid into the system through Federal Insurance Contributions Act that are not paid out to beneficiaries. So we're still in a surplus situation. I understand further is that by law, those surpluses have to be invested in U.S. Treasury and bonds. If you're really interested in preserving and expanding and improving Social Security, aren't you putting that very program at risk by not raising the debt ceiling and potentially putting the United States in default for the first time in its history?
Absolutely. So Social Security makes regular payments to beneficiaries. We have planned payments the first few days in June for some of the lowest income beneficiaries, and then regular payments on June 14th, June 21st, June 28th. If these people don't get their payments, and each Wednesday, the second, third, and fourth Wednesday in each month, about 20 million older Americans get these payments, and they rely on them, and they depend on them to come on the exact day that they're promised. Out of those 20 million older Americans who rely on Social Security, about half, about 10 million, are pretty much living paycheck to paycheck. And if this debt ceiling impasse means that they don't get their money, you're going to see real hardship for people. I mean, these are older Americans going hungry that have no other option. It is an absolute catastrophe for people who've worked their whole lives and who are depending on Social Security.
My time is near expiring. I yield back.
I thank my friend from New York, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Tom McClintock from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to remind my Democratic colleagues that the House acted last month to increase the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion. They all voted against it. It's now up to the Senate whether to send that bill to the President or amend it and send it to conference. Mr. Chairman, perhaps we should enter that episode of Schoolhouse Rock into the committee record since they obviously missed it. Mr. Holtz-Egan, just some basic economics of overregulation. It seems to me that the prosperity in a free society is created by those voluntary exchanges that occur between countless consumers every minute. I pay you $1 for a cup of coffee. What's going on? I'm telling you that your cup of coffee is worth more to me than my dollar. And at the same time, you're telling me that my dollar is worth more to you than your cup of coffee. We make that exchange, and we end up with something of greater value than we took in. We both go away richer. Do I have that basically correct?
Yes,
Now,
except the price of the coffee.
Yeah, true. So suppose some busybody now sticks his nose into the transaction, the ranking member, perhaps. Oh, no, the coffee has to be served between 98 and 103 degrees, and it must be covered if consumed more than 25 feet from the point of sale, and a swizzle stick has to be included if condiments are to be sold at the same location. Doesn't every one of those regulations reduce the value of that exchange for one or the both of us?
Yes, and it'll most likely show up immediately in just higher costs for the coffee.
Right. And they tell us that this is to protect consumers, but isn't the word no the ultimate consumer protection? Of no, your price is too high. No, I don't like the color. No, I can get a better deal down the street. I mean, we all make bad decisions in our lives, but isn't that the price we pay for the freedom to make all of the good decisions in our lives?
Yes, plus the option to go somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly right. I can get it down the street.
I think one of the biggest impacts of regulation is to make it harder for new entrants to come in and compete, and that is where you lose competition in markets. That's where you lose the ability to harness markets to make people better off.
Right. And it's not to say that some regulation isn't necessary. I mean, representations in a market have to be accurate, contracts have to be enforced, currency has to be reliable, products have to function as advertised. Those things that apply to the entire market and that make it trustworthy and reliable, make a market function more efficiently. But isn't that fundamentally different from government simply replacing a consumer's preferences with its own?
I think what you listed are a lot of safety and soundness regulations. People respect and want those. The excessive regulations are those which interfere and make decisions on behalf of people.
Mr. Cruz, let's turn to the fundamental constitutional issue involved in the regulatory state. You know, Madison pointed out that when all of the powers of government are concentrated in the same hands, you have tyranny. That's why they meticulously divided the powers of government. Congress makes law but can't enforce it. The president enforces law but cannot make it, at least he's not supposed to. And then you have an independent judiciary to resolve disputes. Doesn't the modern regulatory state put all of those powers back in the same hands? An unelected agency writes the laws, then enforces the law that it's written. If it accuses you of violating its law, you have to answer to the agency in a court that's run by the agency without a jury, and the agency then keeps the fines that assesses you. Is there a more profound threat to democracy than that?
Well, I think the administrative state has long been a threat. It's something that's grown. It's seen as a fourth branch. It consolidates all those powers that you mentioned. And there could be better ways of doing things.
And completely separates the government from the control of the people, which is the very definition of a democracy.
That's actually worsening because we talked about the relative handful of laws that Congress issues, and regulatory agencies are issuing thousands of rules every year on top of their guidance.
Here's how Alex de Tocqueville framed the subject of this hearing back in 1825, almost 200 years ago. He said, "It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, to which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies the people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is a shepherd." Is that what we're facing as a society today?
It's too easily headed that way, and I think too many new sectors are subject to regulatory burdens. Even the example with coffee that you gave just shows you. If you have burdens put on that aren't necessary and you cut competition, you lessen commerce, you cause consumers to look for other options that they have trouble finding them, it dampens the economy. It dampens the entire competitive structure. It dampens the GDP. And it ends up circling back into this budget debate you're having, because if you have an over-regulated economy, And if you have spending that is also regulatory in nature, you're ending up with a government that's spending too much, going into too much debt.
Which helps-
If you lessen regulation, you can energize things so that you can deal with some of
Wh-
these.
Which helps explain why Mark Zandy is always wrong. I yield back.
And with that, thank you, Mr. McClintock. Now, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holzig, it's great to see you. We joked that we might exchange our statements from 12 years ago that are equally applicable in this slow-moving train wreck that we're involved with. But I'd like to ask you an economic question, if I could. Our friends have referenced that people should work before they get subsidies, welfare. I'm wondering if you, from the economic perspective, could comment on why whether we should examine 20,000 farmers who received $18 billion in subsidies for 37 consecutive years, averaging $1 million per person. Is that an area that may have some economic inefficiency and should be reviewed in the context of what we're doing?
Well, certainly you have the opportunity. This year, the Farm Bill's up for reauthorization,
No,
and
but
I
I'm
would
asking,
encourage you to
should
do
it?
that. Yeah.
Should it? Thank you.
Look at it.
My Republican colleagues have repealed and would like to repeal and voted to repeal some of the subsidies that we have given for energy production. We have seen people rush into this space, not just committing, but investing billions of dollars. If we look at repealing these subsidies that have been enacted into law, does that have a destabilizing effect? Is that a problem for the private sector? Yes, sir.
I would, on this point, disagree with you. I am not a big fan of the strategy in the Inflation Reduction Act on clean energy. Those credits yield enormous
I want
inefficiency.
to ask my question. Repealing billions of dollars of subsidies that people have relied on to make investments, you don't think that's destabilizing?
I think destabilizing is too strong a term. It's a small piece of the energy sector, an even smaller piece of the economy.
And you
And
don't
it's
think
setting
that's
out in the
destabilizing?
wrong direction, in my view, and going
Thank you.
back would not be a mistake.
Well, with all due respect, I think most people would suggest that federal legislation that people have relied upon to make billions of dollars of investment to suddenly repeal them would have a destabilizing effect. And I'll give testimony on the floor of the House in a few minutes from people in the industry and the unions that are involved. Mr. Harris, am I missing something? Isn't that destabilizing?
So I think the only thing that's incorrect about your point was the billions, it should be trillions. So that roughly $370 billion for tax credits in the IRA will catalyze up to $5 trillion investment in the private sector. I've had conversations with executives in the sector. They've said that this bill just kicked off a wave of new interest. I mean, that's really the idea. This isn't just government subsidies for new spending. This is to partner with the private sector to transition to a new way to produce energy. And it's $5 trillion. It's one of the biggest economic.
Thank you. I appreciate your observation. That was my experience in a recent meeting in Houston with dozens of people in the renewable energy sector, talking about the impact that this has in their investment decisions and making a difference, at least for the economy in Texas. I do take the notion that Mr. Norman said it's like we're looking at two different universes. And I take that point. I also agree with the chairman that handing out subsidies without some responsibility is something we should look at, and I don't think it's healthy. But to our ranking member's observation that people look at these issues like tax credits or tax in the abstract. When we get real about the impact that they're having on real live people, it's why the theoretical 22% reduction that people are imagining, when it comes time to put their vote behind it in appropriations or very specific budget decisions, people shy away. It's why we haven't been given a specific litany that would give context and focus to the theoretical act that my Republican friends passed last year. When it comes time to make those cuts real, you're not going to find much enthusiasm or many votes. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back. Oops, I'm 4 seconds over. I'm sorry.
I appreciate my colleagues' sentiments, and now we're going to pass the mic for 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great conversation. And I'd like to respond to some of the things that I heard from the other side as well. Mr. McClintock mentioned this already. I'd like to remind everyone in regards to the debt limit, there was one vote to increase the debt limit, and that was the House. There are three parties. It takes three parties to increase the debt limit. That's the House, the Senate, and the President. If you don't like our plan, why isn't the Senate passing a bill? Why isn't the President proposing something? The folks on the other side keep going back to the clean debt limit, but that just doesn't hold water because there's been negotiations around debt limit discussions a majority of the time. So ignoring the desire of House Republicans to begin to put us on a better fiscal path just does not recognize the political reality. We've had an election. The House is in the majority. We don't agree with the massive spending that's taken place under this administration, and there needs to be some compromise. And we don't expect to get everything that we want, but certainly no one's going to get a clean debt ceiling here. And so for months, we've been asking for this negotiation to take place. And it will take place, and I think we're going to get this done. Everybody understands. We agree on one thing, that we do not want to default, and that won't happen if we get to the table and conclude these negotiations in the next few days. And then another point, and I think that we're on a pathway that could end in disaster over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so it's frustrating to hear this, partisan blame going back and forth. Some of the opening comments of the ranking member. When are we going to get serious about that trajectory? And that's what we're attempting to do. And you talk about we're doing this in the abstract, and then when you talk about specific line items, it's hard to make the cuts. But that's what we're elected to do, to put ourselves on a better path. And I'd like to remind the ranking member in Pennsylvania, he and I were both there in 2008, when we were forced, because we didn't have revenue coming in, to look at every single line item in the budget. And yes, every line item has a constituency, so it's very tough to make these decisions. But I believe, and I think all of us, believe that there's been a massive expansion of the federal government intruding in every area of our lives, and we have to pull it back because we know it doesn't end well if we don't move us on the right path. And so, on this debt relief bill that we did, the public thinks it's perfectly reasonable to go back to the spending levels of COVID when we were at all-time high because of COVID. So going back to what we were spending 6 months ago and then trying to limit spending increase by 1% per year, that's reasonable. And then pulling back COVID dollars that aren't spent, that's reasonable. And then expecting people who are who are relying on government for help, expecting them to put forth the effort to go to work, that's reasonable. That has support from the public. So what is it about our plan that the other side doesn't like? I'd like to hear. I'd like to see a plan come from the Senate. I'd like to see the president come to the table. I think it's time we do that. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you talked about the excessive regulation. I know you do a lot of work on this, and I appreciate your work. I was a business owner, saw that myself, saw the impact on a growing business. But why should an everyday American who's not a business owner care? You know, we do talk about regulation in the abstract, and I know that there are some regulations needed. We all expect that. You mentioned excessive regulation. I wish you had more time. I'd like some framework of what we could use to consider excessive, but we know that the federal government has ballooned, and it's really affecting people's freedom to make their own decisions. But why should an everyday American who goes to work every day care about this growing federal government that thinks they can make decisions for you that you can't make better yourself? Why should they care?
The barriers to entry will produce fewer choices. You'll have fewer places you can go to get the things you want. You'll have less variety of products on the market. They'll cost more. And in the end, your wages won't go as far and your standard of living will not be what it should be. And those are things everybody would experience every day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank Mr. Smucker, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. You and the ranking member have made, I think, important opening comments that help explain some of the differences that we have, but we all share a common goal, and that's to do what's right for the American people. I will take a moment just to briefly respond. I do think there's areas for common ground in response to Mr. Smucker. Some of the framework that's being discussed right now around the debt ceiling negotiation, one side is negotiating in public, but it is true that some of what we're talking about around limitations on spending is the subject of conversation that certainly the White House is engaged on. And let's not get too far ahead of ourselves in predicting that we can't find common ground when in fact progress is being made toward that common ground. So let's not make this all political. A debate and a discussion and negotiation is tough. We have competing priorities. I will say this, I disagree with one point. I'm not sure you meant to make this point precisely, but I just want to clarify. It's not my position that we are elected, quote, to make the cuts. We're elected to make decisions. And part of that means making the tough decisions to realize that a part of the solution here may be to eliminate the fact that in our system and our fiscal structure, we're talking about reducing support for essential programs that some may say we can't afford, but all the while ignoring the fact that some of the wealthiest Americans, and certainly some of the richest corporations in this country, do not even come close to paying their fair share. And that's policy that's embedded in the tax code. But in this particular conversation, one side of the conversation, one side of the debate has decided that we cannot even look in that place to try to come to a solution to this problem. So we do have some differences, and I hope as the conversation evolves, some of that, sorry, Yo-Yo Ma just decided to interrupt my commentary. I do want to, so I appreciate the comment, and I appreciate the debate. I do want to turn to Dr. Harris and ask a question in my remaining time. One of the issues that I've been working on is an increased occurrence, sadly, in the 21st century, of the exploitation of children in our labor markets. It's almost unbelievable at this point in our history that we are seeing an increased use of children in child labor, in factories, which is, I think, something we would all agree ought to be stopped. The difficulty that I would like you to address is that in the process of addressing the sort of regulatory environment, one of the initiatives is to dramatically cut the dollars available to the United States Department of Labor to pursue enforcement of our child labor laws, which means we're essentially sending the message that that's okay. And I don't know that you might have specific information about child labor enforcement, but I wonder if you might, Dr. Harris, comment on the cost, the social cost, the other economic costs, the externalities associated with the failure to enforce regulations that we all agree are based on principles that are common, but that will be nothing but a greeting card to those kids who are out there working in slave conditions. Or perhaps it could relate to other aspects of the regulatory environment. Can you talk about the cost of that loss of enforcement?
Sure, and I'm happy to talk specifically about child labor. Child labor last year, child labor violations went up by 37%. It is almost unfathomable this is a problem in a country as great as the United States, that we have kids working in ways that violate the laws. You know, I agree that we have a labor supply problem. We shouldn't look to children to fix it. When kids are at work, they're not doing other productive things, namely they're not in school, they're not preparing to be adults. It is really a catastrophe, and cutting the funding for the DOL to go ahead and enforce child labor is just a tragedy in light of the trends that we're seeing with increased child labor exploitation.
I very much appreciate that, and I will generously yield back the remaining 22 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
I would like to remind the gentleman from Michigan that playing inspiring music while you're giving your commentary has got to be out of order, but it was impactful, I must say. I'm going to take that into consideration. Thank you, my friend, and I now yield 5 minutes to the good gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Cruz, the average number of federal agency rules issued for every law that was passed from 2007 through 2017 was 27, meaning there's a 27-to-1 ratio during that 10-year period of rules, regulations, mandates forced on the American people by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats for every law that was passed by Congress. You know, the people's representatives, those entrusted and empowered by the Constitution with lawmaking responsibility and authority. And as I think you would agree, as a side comment, that's why, by the way, the REINS Act is such a critically important component of the Limit, Save, Grow bill. The REINS Act, which would require that congressional vote on every major rule that's passed of impact of $100 million or more. Isn't that crazy? We don't consider it major unless it's $100 million. And I will also just point out, we are spending, this is important for the larger issue that we deal with in this committee, our budget, federal budget, $6 to $7 trillion. The president wanted to be $7 trillion, a record budget this year. It's been a little over $6 trillion the last couple of years. That's $20,000 per citizen on an annual basis. Everybody in this room, your share that if you pay a purport, you got to pay $20,000 for your federal government this year. That's not per taxpayer. It's what, $50,000 per taxpayer? $60,000 per household per taxpayer? For what? What in the heck are we getting from our federal government at an individual cost to that effect? And let me just go ahead and pause and make that a question. Let you comment on that, Mr. Cruz. What are we getting for our share of $20,000?
Well, I'll make the point. By the way, you can still get a $1 cup of coffee at Scotchman if you still need to do that. But that index, that ratio of the numbers of rules to the numbers of laws that Congress passes, we kind of jokingly call that the unconstitutionality index. Regulations do a lot of different things, and you all have talked about the ones that are good and the ones that are bad. All that's a great discussion to have. But you've got regulations that are economic in nature. You've got some stuff that's just paperwork. You've got environmental. You've got health and safety. You've got a new surge now in social regulation and social programs, especially after COVID, in the wake of the things like the rental extensions and things of that sort. But people are getting different things for it. But I think the notion of getting together and looking at things we can do to grow the economy and reduce regulation, remember, your choice is never no regulation. That's one thing I think we really need to get across. Your choice is always between political disciplines, regulatory disciplines, and then competitive disciplines also. You can have an agency write a rule, but that's not necessarily a good regulation. Capitalism doesn't mean companies just run around doing whatever they want to do. In free markets and free enterprise, you've got a company with upstream business suppliers, downstream business customers, consumers, Wall Street, advertisers, the media. They're all sort of forces that regulate. So when you say, what are we getting for all that regulation? I think in a lot of cases, not what we should be getting, because we might be doing things wrong, incorrectly, and especially in emerging technologies and emerging businesses and emerging companies. This notion of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on EV charging stations. I was asking someone at the Consumer Electronics Show, I said, well, okay, so you're doing these stations, well, by yourself? I said, what are you doing to also add in cell tower cells and things like that? So how are you working with other infrastructure owners to do it? So right here on the cutting edge, when you all are talking about saving money and not expanding government now, you've got an opportunity to really wall off the future from the way we're regulating in the past and consumers not getting much from it. In artificial intelligence, in new electric vehicle charging stations, and all of these new technologies, we're going down the regulatory path right now. And consumers are not going to get good deals out of it, I think. So I think the notion of the Article 1 Reg Budget Act 2 in addressing some of this and deciding what should the economy spend on regulation? I mean, that's a serious question that you all have to think about. You know what federal spending is now. You know what the debt and deficit are now. How much do you think you're willing to put into regulations? And I think that it's what the economy can stand, and it's what consumers will get out of it.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz, for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Now, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to each of our witnesses. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you are a frequently called expert by Republican colleagues, and I gather it's pretty clear from your testimony this morning you do not think this is a time when we should be increasing deficits. We should try to reduce them.
Correct.
And your testimony before the Ways and Means Committee over the years has been very consistent that tax cuts do not pay for themselves, and that remains true today, doesn't it not?
Yes, it does.
And so adding another $2 or $3 trillion to the deficit by cutting taxes is largely likely to have the same impact as if we increase spending by that amount. In fact,
I don't think I'd agree with that.
You would agree that it certainly increases the deficit if you cut taxes, since they don't pay for themselves.
Yeah.
And the estimate from the Congressional Budget Office, which you once headed, said that the Trump tax cut got up pretty close to $2 trillion in adding to our deficit. And I guess I would have a lot more confidence in the view that our chairman has advocated that we need to get the deficit under control if he were not already sponsoring another massive tax cut that is estimated to cost trillions of dollars. Indeed, yesterday, there was a report out that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Smith, wanted to have a tax cut as his birthday gift on, I believe it's June the 16th. The data that I've seen suggests from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy that the richest 5% of Americans would receive nearly 2/3 of the benefit of the type of tax cut that he says he wants, and the richest 1% of Texans would get a tax cut of over $80,000 in the first year of that birthday present. That's a pretty good sized birthday present, a little bigger than most Texans get. It seems pretty clear that the reason that we are going to receive another Republican tax cut proposal instead of the much promised Republican budget is that while they're very specific in the benefits they would accord the most elite members of American society, they are unwilling to be specific at all as to where these cuts would fall. Because if the American people fully understand the impact of the cuts that they're making, whether it's to border law enforcement, to veterans health care, environmental law enforcement, or the approximate $1,000 in cuts to Pell Grants, that those would be unacceptable to the American people. The current concern for budget deficits, which I share and which I think we should find a way to try to bring under control, is not brought under control by adding trillions of additional dollars in tax cuts. Mr. Harris, what would be the effect of another Republican tax law cut for those at the top at a tune of $2 to $3 trillion?
Well, I think that you captured the distributional consequences well. I will say with respect to the TCJA and the macroeconomy, in 2017, we had this supply side experiment that was on a scale that we've never seen before. It was a $1.5 trillion tax cut, perhaps even more expensive. And the data, the economic studies that have been performed afterwards show it was ineffective at all at increasing investment. Investment did increase incrementally, but that could be attributed to growth in aggregate demand, oil prices, and other factors. And in fact, we didn't see growth in business formation, we didn't see growth in employment, and we didn't see growth in median wages after TCJA. So I would characterize it as a very costly failed experiment.
Thank you. A standard line in here from last week and probably this week's hearing is, oh, this is a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. Well, I would ask unanimous consent to add to the record a report from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which has been critical of both Democrats and Republicans, pointing out that the way we are right now, we've seen a decline recently in revenues, and they suggest that neither the arguments for the pandemic policy nor the delayed effect of the so-called pro-growth tax cuts have produced a meaningful that the effect of them is both to impact negatively our budget situation, that there's both a revenue problem and a spending problem. And I'd ask unanimous consent to include that report in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Mr. Harned, I have a big manufacturing district. I don't think people realize the role manufacturing plays in our economy. By the way, just for people listening at home, you know Wisconsin right now is the biggest manufacturing state in the country as percent of workforce? Did you know that? Good. Now you learned something. Wisconsin's #1 in manufacturing, so you got to know. Okay, but Mr. Harned, do you have any sense of how overregulation has affected manufacturing?
I'm Mr. Cruz. I think you asked me.
Oh, Karen.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I mean, that is an example of a very heavily regulated, industry, and it does. I know of one, manufacturer just in Dallas that has just 7 employees, and he is spending, an exorbitant amount of his money on regulatory compliance because of all the rules that.
Could you compare, this is something compared to other countries.
Right.
Could you compare the regulatory burden in U.S. compared to our competitors?
I cannot, but maybe one of my colleagues can.
Okay. What steps can Congress take to ease these burdens?
Right. I think, again, that there's a lot. Look, when somebody, especially a small business owner, is inspected, for example, the administration or the agency official is going to look for something to show for their work, right? And there's so many regulations on the books that really are just sitting there, waiting to be used. So if there's not a real issue, they've got all these regulations they can pick from that maybe haven't been enforced in years, and actually some studies have been done on that. Getting rid of the regulatory underbrush would be a very big part of that. Also, in doing regulation, making sure it's not one size fits all. Small businesses are their own regulatory compliance officer, and their voice is not heard at the regulatory process as much as it should be, or when alternatives are suggested, the agencies so easily dismiss those. So strengthening that analysis would be great.
Thank you. Next question, and I guess this is more for Mr. Cruz. The administration is pushing retirement account fiduciaries to consider ESG factors in evaluating their investments. And you are directing, and the Biden administration is by executive order directing federal agencies to take a whole of government approach to enact its social justice goals. How does this whole of government approach affect the private sector in the degree to which the federal government's going to be weighing in for social justice goals.
Yeah, I think this is a big, important issue, and I think you ought to pay a lot of attention to it. You remember President Obama had the pen and phone, and that he used to go around Congress, he would say. And now with President Biden, he says the same thing, that he can go around Congress, and his agencies have a series of what he calls whole of government initiatives. There's competition policy, there's equity, there's climate crisis, there's digital currency, there's long COVID. So these are.
I'll ask you a question. I was recently out to eat dinner at one of these places. You know, you're a congressman, people come up and talk to you. I had a gal come up and talk to me. She was in human resources for a bank, which of course is very highly regulated. And she said they had a job opening for months, but they weren't able to fill it because the only applicants were white guys.
Well,
is this something you hear about?
I didn't hear that, but the interesting thing here, though, is you've got laws that agencies they use. They have their rules that they issue, but now with guidance documents and so forth, which is the way a lot of these new whole of government programs will be driven, I think you've got even less transparency in the regulatory state, and it's going to affect the private sector quite a bit. And it needs to be there needs to be more transparency for it all.
Well, not just transparency. Does it bother you, these type of regulations? I mean, when I talk to my human resources professionals, it's becoming an increasing problem.
Well, I think you do, and they do. And initially, you mentioned the investment funds being required to invest.
Yeah, not the investment funds.
Things
Well, let's talk about.
But that is increasing regulation indirectly.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the hiring part of a business, the degree to which the federal government is weighing in. Is this an increasing problem, and do you expect it to become a greater problem?
It could. I'm not an HR expert. Can't maybe.
Well, there's one. The other one is you as an HR expert when we're talking about federal regulation. Not really. You don't feel like answering that question. Okay. Well, we're going to go fight for you guys anyway.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, General. Ranking Member, to all the witnesses, thank you for being here. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, obviously I've had the pleasure of being in committees where you've testified before, and so I think it is important that we continue to listen to you and hear from you today. So I'm going to focus my questions on you. The other members, you can either zone out, but don't worry about it. I'm just going to hit the doctor over here. I'm going to talk about 3 issues, Doctor. Permitting, immigration, and the deficit and the lack of progress on reducing our deficit. When it comes to permitting, I know that you did not mention that in your testimony, but do you believe that permitting can fit in, at least when it comes to federal infrastructure, to the broader issue of regulatory burden?
Yes.
How?
So the permitting process is a set of regulations on how reviews will in fact be conducted, who signs off, what approvals are necessary to do big infrastructure projects. They involve multiple levels of government, each of which has their own regulations. So it is in general a regulatory thicket to go through the permitting process.
Exactly. Now, look, I obviously support strong environmental regulations, but it just seems they're being weaponized these days, unfortunately. And there must be proper community input, and there must be a timely court process, but they just can't be used for an automatic veto over a project. So I'm proud that we at least are setting out some permitting principles to speed up the pace of projects, especially when it deals with clean energy projects, and move this conversation ahead. And so I'd appreciate you continuing to talk about that as well. When it comes to immigration reform, how does immigration over-regulation, how can that hurt economic growth? And could there be streamlining when it comes to immigration that help address that issue?
Well, certainly, again, the visa granting system is a large set of regulations. And, we have a very elaborate set of regulations, for example, that govern the issuance of visas for work purposes. And we have H-1Bs and H-2As and all sorts of categories. In general, you like a labor market where people can flow from one opportunity to another with a minimum of costs, and where businesses can compete for high-quality employees. And all of those regulations lock people down and interfere with that mobility. They limit the number of workers. And I think this is an opportune moment to rethink the strategies we have toward immigration for work purposes.
Exactly. Thank you. Now, I want to go to an article that you were a part of in The Economist, I think it was just a couple weeks back. Basically interviewed 3 former CBO bosses, yourself, Doug Elmendorf, as well as Keith Hall. The summary of that article was basically all 3 of you were unanimous in your view that a failure to lift the debt ceiling now, therefore opening the door to default, is a horrific idea, is the last paragraph of this article. However, prior to that, your statement and what you say is the average American has gone through the 21st century with presidents who said we didn't have a problem. So why should anyone bother now with hard reforms? There's going to be a generation of voters that can't get anything they want because all the money has been spoken for. Can you elaborate on that statement?
Well, certainly. So I wonder about the unwillingness to take on the reform of Social Security and Medicare in particular, when these programs are such central planks of the social safety net, and both are in financial danger. A person who is 55 now does not know what the deal will be when they retire with Social Security. And that seems to me just wrong. It's a terrible way to run a program. Medicare in 5 years, Part A bankrupts. So, but there's no groundswell to fix this. We don't hear that. And so I look back at the 21st century where the debt has only gone up and we've had shown no political will to control it. And my old boss, George W. Bush, essentially had budgets that said we're going to win the war against global terror at all costs, period. President Obama put out 8 years of budgets that said there's nothing wrong with the federal budget except the rich have to pay their fair share. President Trump said nothing. He didn't use the words deficit or debt for 4 years. And this administration came in saying, hey, we can have whatever you want, Build Back Better. Tons of new entitlement programs, it's all good. So the average American who relies on the president to identify big problems and needed reforms has not been told we have a big problem, and we do, and there will have to be substantial reforms of important programs, and there will be. No one knows that.
My time is up. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and witnesses. Thank you for being here. We've just heard a significant amount of stuff that's thrown at us. We've heard from, I've heard things from Moody's being quoted, different organizations, CBO, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Nobody's talking about the consumer. So let's do a couple of things here. Let me ask a couple of questions here. Mr. Cruz, over the last 10 years, are Americans paying more for health care than they were a decade ago? Yes.
I think so, but I don't follow the healthcare issue. But
All right. Doug?
I know I am.
Healthcare spending per person has risen in the United States.
Okay. Also to you, are Americans more healthy now than they were a decade ago or less healthy?
Less healthy by many measures.
Okay, thank
Life
you.
expectancy, obesity, we can go down.
Are there more regulations in healthcare over the last decade?
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's number one. Number two, are Americans paying more for energy costs now than they were a decade ago? How about just 3 years ago?
Yes.
Okay. Paying more for gas at the pump and for the cost of electricity in their home.
Yes.
American businesses are paying more for electricity. Are there more regulations, Ms. Harned, in the energy industry now than there were just a few years ago?
Yes.
Okay. So, all right, let's go to another one. The cost of capital, okay? The banking industry. Are Americans paying more to borrow money now than they were just a few short years ago?
Yes.
Okay. Are there more regulations in the banking industry and in the financial industry today than there were just a few years ago?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now we've got the transportation sector. We've got just a few years ago, pre-pandemic, the price of transportation had kind of leveled off. Are Americans paying more for transportation, cost of vehicles, cost of flying on an airplane, you name it across the board? Are they paying more now than they were just a few short years ago?
Yes.
Are there more regulations in place today than there were just a few short years ago?
Yes.
Well, there seems to be a very common thread here that the more that this place regulates, the higher costs go. Now, look, I'm going to put my small business hat on here. I ran a dental practice for 25 years. Every single time the federal government stepped in the middle of it, it drove healthcare costs up in my practice. All right, we've talked a lot about the bureaucracy here in D.C., but there's a sub-bureaucracy that's been created in the private sector to deal with the bureaucracy in D.C. So now you've got the White House, you've got the Senate, you've got the House, you've got the bureaucracy, you've got the private sector bureaucracy. All of this stands in the way of American progress. Fair statement?
Absolutely.
All right. So let me ask you, let's go back in time just a little bit, okay? Let's go back to the mid to late 80s. All right, Mr. Cruz, this one will be for you. We had the most regulated telecommunications industry in the world, right? Ma Bell
That's right.
controlled all of the long distance, right? We deregulated them. Are Americans paying less money today for their long distance and communication services than they were in the 80s?
Sure, there's a lot of innovation that emerges from getting rid of government-supported monopolies and expanding, and it's a good thing to do.
So right now, what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been advocating for, and what we have seen consistently from this administration, is that they're going to regulate more and more and more to control the business environment, and it's going to drive the cost up, and then they're going to want to give everybody a subsidy so they can afford the cost of the regulation that they put in place. That's a mell of a hess. I mean, it really is. I mean, that just creates a significant problem. So why aren't we thinking about things in a different vein? We deregulated telecommunications industry, and we got the greatest period of innovation and technology that we've ever had. Why don't we do that on transportation? Why don't we deregulate healthcare? Vertical integration in healthcare is strangling people's ability to access care and utilize the system. By the way, doctors are getting paid less, and everybody else in between between the patients getting paid more. Is that a function of regulation?
Yes.
So I think the basic notion here is that the more that this place regulates, the more it costs consumers, and for consumers to afford it, the government then has to provide a subsidy. Why don't we just get the middleman out of the way and let the consumer go direct to the provider? Doesn't that make sense? All right, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ballin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I will start with where we just ended up in the previous line of questioning. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have us believe that regulations are absolutely killing our economy. And just to highlight what Ranking Member Boyle said earlier, we have emerged from the pandemic and the recession, the inflationary period in a better place than all of our economic peers worldwide. Recovery has been faster, it's been stronger. And so we have regulation essentially to ensure the health and safety of Americans. That's why we have it. It's not to strangle the growth or productivity of the US economy. And so I think about the summer and where we are right now. We're about to head into a period of extensive travel, whether it's by car or by air. And we know that this fight that we're having right now over debt ceiling and this ransom note that we are being asked to pay would cut money from the FAA. It would lead to a third of airports losing air traffic control. It would lead to cuts in TSA personnel, longer wait times in excess of 2 hours for regular Americans, and would also bring about cuts to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, would lead to workforce reductions, which would increase danger for American travelers. So regulations are not designed to stifle anyone. They're designed to protect American consumers. Now, Mr. Harris, from your experience at the Treasury Department, can you tell us what default would actually look like for regular American families like the Vermonters that I represent?
So it's tough to say precisely, but it would without a doubt mean higher interest rates. So anyone who has a credit card, anyone who wants to take out a mortgage, any small business owner who wants to borrow and access to capital is a big part of the small business industry, they would pay more for every single one of those loans. If you have a 401k, almost certainly you'd see a decline in the stock market. I don't know by how much, but you would experience pain that way. And you would see job losses. You would, according to Moody's, I know that we cite them a lot, but they're willing to do the projections and they're reputable, up to 8 million jobs in a worst case scenario. So across the economy, everyone would be affected.
And when we look at the economy as a whole, does this crisis, this manufactured crisis around the debt ceiling, improve our fiscal situation? The brinksmanship alone, does that improve our fiscal situation?
It's a great question. Because interest rates go up, that means we'll be paying more for this $31 trillion in debt. There's been projections that I've seen everywhere from Brookings to Moody's that put it right around $800 billion in extra interest spending over 10 years. And that's kind of the irony of this, which is if you're doing this to improve the fiscal situation, but yet you're leading to almost $1 trillion in higher interest payments, in some ways it's counterproductive.
And do you think it's fair to say that we're already experiencing financial costs that we will have to bear because of the brinksmanship alone, regardless of what happens as we approach the so-called X date? Are we already experiencing concerns in the markets because we're at this moment?
So we are seeing some stress in the short-term part of the curve. So Treasury issues different durations for debt. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, Treasury had an auction on a 4-week bill that was the highest ever on a 4-week bill maturing in early June. Another problem that arises from this is that after this is all over, Treasury has to raise a lot of cash because in the world's greatest economy, you don't want to be stuck at close to zero. So raising all that cash and reversing some of these extraordinary measures means it should be equivalent to around, this is according to Bank of America, about a 25 basis point hike in interest rates. So yeah, we've already incurred some costs.
Thank you. I want to, I have less than a minute left. I want to shift testimony just a little bit. Mr. Harris, in your written testimony, you wrote about how policy reforms designed to lower barriers to work and increase the labor force partition rates are actually better for economic growth than the failed policies in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You wrote, quote, examples of such policies include an expansion in the Earned Income Tax Credit, better access to paid leave for caregivers, universal access to pre-K, and subsidies to raise the demand and supply of childcare. So if you could just take one example, childcare, how does that have a positive impact for working mothers, for families, and for the economy as a whole?
It leads more working mothers to the labor market, which is better for the aggregate economy and it's better for those families.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. When we think about everybody in this room and those who might be viewing this on TV, what would the 8th grader think of our discussion? And why I pick on the 8th grade is it was in 8th grade that I started my first business, where I grew up in the North Country, where you cut lawns in the summer and shoveled snow in the winter. I began to understand the value of $1 and the value of taking debt, to include buying a new lawnmower, buying a new snow shovel. And you know what? 8th graders today, I think, are savvier than I was back then because they've got more tools at their disposal. But the question is, how do they use those tools? And the ranking member in his comments opening comments used the elephant in the room. I would suggest to you we need to look at the hut in the room. Anybody know who the Hutt is, as in Jabba the Hutt? And the point is, if you look at Jabba the Hutt was a fictional character in the movie Star Wars, who better than to educate today's 8th grader than their parents, who were roughly that age when Jabba the Hutt came on the scene? But Jabba basically was a gimme more, gimme more, gimme more bureaucracy that never ever yielded the results that necessary, but it was just give me more. And when you think about the generational nature of what we're talking about here, what we make decision-wise on debt is being passed along to our, in my case, my grandkids. We've got 10, and they're all pretty sharp cookies because their parents chose to teach them a lot of things, not only, morals and ethics and faith and family, but to teach them basic finance. So I think we can fairly ask the question to anyone, how do we, whether you're an individual, whether you're a family, whether you're a business, whether you're a government, view debt? Think if Alexander Hamilton was here, what views he might have. So I guess as we look at, are we dealing with symptoms? Are we dealing with root causes? The symptoms are what the symptoms are, unless we deal with the root causes. And this is not Democrat or Republican. This is about dealing with the root causes of what we're trying to deal with, then get back on it. So having said that, I would, as I ask my 2 minutes of questions here, I would ask you to consider, will the 8th grader understand a little bit of what you're saying? And if they don't, more importantly, if they turn and ask their parents, what did they just say, Mom? What did they just say, Dad? That their parents can give them an answer, because I believe we're way past time to teach financial education, not how to spend your inheritance. That's not financial education, but basic finance for individuals or businesses, as we've referred to here. So, Ms. Harned, according to a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal, average inflation-adjusted payments to low-income households has grown from about $10,000 to roughly $45,000. Over the same period, the percentage of prime working age adults in the bottom 20% of income earners who actually worked plummeted from 68% to 36%. How do federal regulations and policies encouraging low-income individuals to stay at home instead of finding work, how do they work, and what can Congress do to address the issue of unnecessary regulations that actually deflate incentive?
Right. Well, so there's been many great proposals that you all have introduced that would get rid of, regulations on the books that haven't been enforced for years. Once you get a regulation on, it's like the Hotel California. You never get it off. There are a lot that have not been enforced, and they need to get off the books. Also, when it comes to hiring, that is a whole big mess now, as far as each employee costs you $10,000 or $11,000 per employee for a small business owner. So they're thinking a lot about regulation when they're thinking about that. And so getting rid of the burdens of that. And finally, I would just say 80% of small business owners support what you all passed in the, getting work requirements tied to government subsidies.
So thank you very much. And I see my time has expired. I yield back. Mr. Yocum, you are recognized. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you slide in there. Madam, you are recognized.
Thank the chairman and the ranking member for, I am sure, bringing us together for a positive reaction to what is the best way to move forward. And I think the semblance of this title is about prosperity. Let me acknowledge that all of us would care to have prosperity. All of us would want to take that back to our communities. Cities have been called the cradle of civilization. Cities are the closest to the people. Cities are required in some instances to balance their budgets, but in doing so, if there is a catastrophic Hurricane Harvey like Houston, Texas, catastrophic Hurricane Ike or Katrina, well-renowned of 2005 as my recollection occurs, they are looking to the federal government to be able to provide that off-ramp. And so as we sit here and debate amongst ourselves about potential prosperity, we also have to consider that prosperity does not come if the only answer we have in the pending days is a default. So I'd like to pose this question to Mr. Benjamin Harris on the trickle-down effect of a default. We're talking about prosperity, but what would be the trickle-down effect on that, on a city, the top 10 cities, which includes Houston, Texas, Chicago, New York, but yet the rural hamlets, who, from my perspective, are enormously dependent on federal aid and support?
So there are many different effects. The first would be on financing. So as I'm sure you know, municipalities rely on well-functioning credit markets in order to finance the services they provide. You would see a potential blow-up in those markets. It would be much more costly for cities to borrow to meet those needs. Then, of course, the people who live in those cities would also suffer from higher costs, everything from higher costs from a mortgage to paying more for their credit card. But then there's also the potential costs related to the remedy, so to speak. And so if we do see those costs, those cuts in discretionary spending, just to give you one example, and then I'll stop. You know, I've spoken a lot to some business leaders who are really worried about this cut in transportation spending related to the airports around the country. And it's not just the increased 2 hours wait time at TSA. We could actually see up to 300 different air traffic controllers towers shut down, which means that these smaller cities and towns are left out of our nation's air travel network.
Well, let's continue to pursue that. And as I do so, let me ask unanimous consent to put into the record White House pushes to save key COVID programs and debt ceiling talks. Ask unanimous consent. And as well, McCarthy bracing for defections eyes a fraught path to a debt limit deal. Ask unanimous consent to place these in the record, Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Let me just quickly, as my time goes, Dr. Harris, the potential of losing 7 million jobs, a spike in unemployment. We've been going along at about a 3% unemployment rate, which has barely been a gift to all of us, even though there are unemployed persons in, unfortunately, groups that suffer the most, African Americans, young people, et cetera, that we have to continue to work at. But 7 million, and wiping out 10 trillion in household wealth and result in people near retirement losing tens of thousands in savings. And I do want to put on the record in the brink of this Memorial Day, which is to honor the fallen, but 30 million veterans losing, of course, their ability for their medical appointments. Can you pierce into that this is not a game of, I appreciate, having the ability to cut costs, which shows that Americans say that's exciting to do. But let's pierce into how it wobbles the economy, how it may collapse the economy, and how cities, counties, rural areas are going to be hit.
So I think you touched on a lot of the costs. It's difficult to specify the costs because they've been unspecified at this point. We have these aggregate costs, aggregate caps leading out 10 years to an economy. We don't know what the economy will look like in 2033. We haven't seen the specific costs, so it's virtually impossible to comment on what those cuts will mean because I don't know what they are yet. Now, we've seen a lot of speculation, and we know that if we're going to firewall defense cuts and protect defense spending from any sort of reductions, and we're talking only about non-defense discretionary spending, then we have to make assumptions. And those assumptions are just catastrophic in many of the ways that you just characterized. Look, I'm an economist. We don't make value judgments all that often. I happen to think that cutting support for veterans is immoral. I think that cutting support for housing stability is incredibly disruptive. We're talking about maybe hundreds of thousands of people being evicted or being without their housing because of housing support, just like that, just because of a debt ceiling impasse. So it's really difficult to specify because I don't know exactly what cuts will come, but based on the assumptions we've made, it would be really harmful for probably millions of Americans.
It would not, as my last sentence, Mr. Chairman, in your mind, it would not promote prosperity.
The cuts, no, not at all.
I thank the gentlelady
Yield
from
back.
Texas and yield 5 minutes to my friend from Indiana, Mr. Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today to share your expertise on this important issue. Deregulation is an essential component to economic growth. It allows for greater efficiency and competition in the marketplace, and thus greater prosperity for all Americans. The Trump administration took significant steps to reduce regulation in a meaningful way that benefited all Americans. According to the Council of Economic Advisors, the previous administration's deregulation efforts were estimated to raise real incomes by $3,100 per household per year. Unfortunately, President Biden and congressional Democrats undid several common sense deregulation efforts and developed new policies that increase red tape and reduce accountability for regulatory bureaucrats. The Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service estimates that between 3,000 and 4,500 final rules are published annually. In 2016, there were 315 significant regulatory rules enacted, while only 214 public laws were passed. In fact, between 1996 and 2016, there were only 3 years in which there were more public laws enacted than significant regulatory rules. This illustrates, to me at least, an alarming problem. There's absolutely no reason that the United States government should allow for unelected bureaucrats to make more rules impacting the lives of Americans than the U.S. Congress. Every student learns in Government 101 that there are 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. But the unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats that constantly interfere in the lives of businesses and everyday Americans essentially amounts to a shadow 4th branch of government. Since 1960, the total number of regulators has grown from 57,000 people to over 288,000 regulators, which means that over 3,600 regulators were added to government every year since 1960. We need to seriously reevaluate the regulatory environment in this country, and Congress has ceded too much of its own authority to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And we need to explore ways through Congress to reclaim our Article I constitutional authority. So my first question for Dr. Holtz-Eakin: can you estimate the overall size of the regulatory state in the United States economy?
Not off the top of my head. There are a number of estimates out there, but you can count the regulations, you can count the pages or the lines or the number of rulemakings, but it's the economic impact that matters. And all we know is that that's an enormous burden right now. And that I think what you heard today is not a cry for no regulation, but to have high-quality regulation done when necessary at the least possible cost. And Congress providing incentives to do that is the important step we need to make now.
So from your perspective, how has overregulation fueled inflation and stifled economic growth?
Well, it certainly is an enormous headwind to economic growth. At this moment, it's heading in the wrong direction from the point of view of inflation. Additional regulations are costs that have to be passed on to consumers in one form or another, and thus place upward pressure on prices at a time when we'd like to go the other direction.
Can you talk about the impact that overregulation has had on our small business environment in the United States?
It's a real concern. There's some specifics. For example, in the aftermath of Dodd-Frank, we've averaged fewer than 5 new banks per year. We used to average dozens and dozens of banks started every year. So competition goes down in providing those services. We've seen a real decline in startups leading into the pandemic. We were deeply concerned about the average age of American firms because we weren't getting new startups. They provide new products, better competition. Improving that climate, I think, is a first-order challenge for better economic performance in the U.S.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Cruz, given that it's been proven time and time again that deregulatory policies are good for economic growth, can you share some examples of where you see opportunities for deregulation?
Yeah, well, I think there are opportunities, but there's opportunities for this body, I think, in addressing the question, because we talked about the successes in the Trump era in regulatory budgeting, airline deregulation, things of that sort. But as I'd indicated early on in my initial remarks, the notions of one in, two out, the notions of unfunded mandates reform, the notions of small business relief, those kinds of notions are bipartisan. They're rooted. They go way back. You find regulatory budgeting back in the Jimmy Carter era. There was always, and that's when you got the airline trucking deregulation and banking deregulations. So you had this dramatic decrease in the amount of economic regulation in the economy. Environmental regulations, of course, increased, and they're still increasing now, but I think the big concern that you all have to reckon with now is, you mentioned the numbers of rules coming out from agencies as opposed to lawmakers, but now it's increasingly the independent agencies that don't get the regulatory review at the OMB that the executive branch agencies get. And I think a lot of the new surges in regulation, we were asked about some of the equity rules and some of the ESG type programs. It's a lot of the financial bodies that are doing that. And yet they're not reviewed at OMB. And OMB has just put out new guidance that's comment date is coming up June 7th. New guidance that is even weakening the potential overview because the threshold for review is going from 100 million up to 200 million for the expected cost of regulation, and you don't really know. As Dr. Holtz-Eakin said, we don't really know. But there are enormous amounts of money, and I think if we can wrestle with some of the comments that Dr. Harrison made, I think of removing entry barriers.
The gentleman's time has expired. I apologize for cutting you
Thank you
off.
to the witnesses and
Trying to let everybody, indulge everybody to have the fullness of discussion, but a few more folks and want to respect their time. Thank you, Mr. Yakum. And now would yield 5 minutes to Mr. Espaillat, gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just let me read some headlines real quickly. Our speaker says the debt limit deal will bite impossible. Our speaker faces balancing act on debt ceiling deal. Our speaker tells House Republicans are nowhere near. Our speaker meeting ends with no deal on debt ceiling. The speaker holds a productive talk. This theater is about to end. The curtain will come down on this theater that has occurred 78 times, including 49 times under Republican administration. So this effort to talk about spending and gut programs that are so essential to workers and families in the United States, this effort to create a theater leading us to a potential precipice is about to end today or tomorrow. So, Mr. Harris, having said that, the Default on America Act will force the administration to make cuts that will remove the government's ability to enforce existing regulations. One rule that may be effective will be the Department of Labor's ability to ensure that workers earn and are paid fair wages. Given the workforce challenge that America already faces, like reports of 100,000 nurses leaving the workforce due to unfair wages and burnout, particularly during the pandemic, how do you think the lack of enforcement would affect the U.S. economy?
So I'm glad you asked about the labor market. As I mentioned in my written testimony, I think competition in the labor market is an incredibly important issue. I think the labor market right now is characterized by lack of competition in many areas, and that means we need government intervention in some ways to get workers their market wage. I think in many circumstances, including with nurses, there's good evidence that they're not being paid their market wage. So this is really an example of government intervention being necessary in order to get workers what they deserve.
Okay, the Default on America Act also imposes work requirements for Medicaid recipients and increased work requirements for SNAP recipients. These requirements would threaten food assistance for several thousand women, children, families in my district. There is no evidence to suggest that these increased work requirements would decrease reliance on safety net programs. What are some of the policies that Congress can put forward that would actually improve employment rates while also ensuring that Americans are able to meet their basic needs? What tools are we already implementing or have proven to reduce poverty?
So on work requirements, let me say that I understand the theoretical appeal. The problem with work requirements is they really don't work in practice. So Iowa tried this, they strengthened the work requirements. What happened is you saw very little, if any, employment boost, but what you did see was the state of Iowa having to pay 2.5 times to implement those work requirements. It was a lose-lose situation. As far as prosperity policies that could increase employment and help lower-income families, I mean, I think that SNAP is a really important thing. It's difficult to be a productive member of society if you're hungry. Pro-employment policies include a stronger EITC, better childcare to get more women in particular into the labor market, and of course, better spending on workforce training.
And finally, I think I have a minute left. Moody's Analytics indicated that the Republican cuts to spending in the Default on America Act will result in a lower GDP for 2024 and nearly 800,000 fewer jobs. This is an artificial crisis that was tried to be created that has real consequences in the job market and, of course, on Wall Street. What's your view on that?
So my view is there's a time and a place for discussions around spending, and it's not holding the U.S. and world economy hostage in doing so. I think that there's an appropriations process. We have appropriations committees, and that's the appropriate place to have discussions about discretionary spending. The problem with doing it over the debt limit is that you create so much financial and economic chaos that you really decrease the prosperity of Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Leader, I yield back.
I thank my friend from New York and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Great discussion on the regulatory environment. I would use the word hobbling. If you've ever seen a horse hobbled and the inability to move. We have a hobbled economy because of a regulatory front that it runs counter to the rule of law. I heard Mr. Harris talk about the rule of law. Article 1, Section 1, U.S. Constitution says all legislative powers will be vested in the Congress. And so for many years, we were the world reserve currency status and perceived as such, in part to the truth of what you said, because we adhered to the rule of law. But in an environment where we have cubicle decisions, people that in their desk in front of their computer screen are making decisions, not elected representatives that are sent to Washington to represent the people, now we have a hobbled economy. And so some would say, well, you know, things from the Democrat viewpoint, things, you know, that they're seeing upticks in certain statistics that they can pick. Can you imagine what would happen if we would unleash the wisdom of our founding fathers and return power and decision-making back to the states? And I'm so grateful for a panel that, for the most part, you know, has been talking about that. So I'm going to give 3 numbers: 13,000, 14,000, and 18,000. 13,000, that's how much real incomes would be higher per person had regulations remained at the 1980 levels, according to a study by Mercatus Center. That is about $4 trillion that would have been added to our GDP that hovers between 22 trillion and 25 trillion. It's almost 1/5 increase in our GDP. So 13,000, how much real incomes would be higher per person had regulations remained at 1980 levels. By the way, that's about the time we tripped 1 trillion in gross national indebtedness. 1 trillion, now we're at 31.5. I'll give you another number, 14,000. That's how much each American household pays right now annually for government regulation, or 1.9 trillion annually according to the Center by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. 18,800. That's how much it would cost someone to print the entire code of federal regulations at FedEx. Because, as mentioned, in 2021, the Code of Federal Regulations is 188,321 pages. In 1960, it was 22,877 pages. In 1950, it was just under 10,000 pages, or just 5% of the figure from 2021. The total estimated cost of 2023 economic significant regulations range from $55 billion to $78 billion, according to self-reported information by agencies. And what are some of these regulations? American people have a right to ask that. From this month, early this month, here's a federal regulation. Toy gun markings from the Department of Commerce to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Updated safety standards for bedside sleepers. Surface coating operation for cars and light-duty trucks. National standards for real estate inspection. The Agricultural Department is adjusting its civil penalties for inflation. Non-aeronautical airport closure procedures. And in California, air quality management from the EPA. It was mentioned that there's $120 billion worth of regulations, $150 right now under the Biden administration. So that's the cost of regulatory adherence. It was $15 billion under Trump. It was $120 billion under the Obama administration. So many of these regulations come in because of the climate ideology. So, Mr. Harris, I am going to ask you a question. In your opening statement, you mentioned the word hurricane. And I know it'd be tough to maybe flip to that, but I think what you said, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, that the disruption you all are looking at, and you just left the Biden administration, that you're looking at economic disruption. I think you mentioned hurricanes is caused by climate change. Is that correct? Did I remember your statement correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to read something to you because I think it's so important how many of our federal regulations are adherence to the climate ideology. So I'm going to read to you from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They state there is no consensus, quote, no consensus on the role of human activity on changes to Atlantic hurricane activity. That same body, the United Nations body, says also determined that since 1900, there's been no trend in the amount of landfall events in the United States. I could go through from the United Nations panel on floods, same thing, no increase on trends in frequency. When it comes to extreme temperature, I mean, the science is being tossed on its head, whereas a few years ago, we were talking about 4 and 5 degrees, now we're talking about 2. Here's what I wanted to land the plane by saying. The narrative is out there, and we're sacrificing our prosperity on the altar of the church of nature. And we've got to push back. We've got a 200-300-year supply of oil and gas under this country, and we have got to start fighting with both fists. If we don't, China and Russia will continue to laugh at us while they don't appease the Paris Climate Accord. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma and yield 5 minutes to my friend from Michigan, Lisa McLean.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I want to start by asking just a simple question, is to make sure that we're all in agreement in theory. The reason, and would you agree with this statement, the reason we have regulation and regulators is to keep us safe, healthy, and really the economy strong. Anyone disagree? Okay, good. No one disagrees. I would agree with you. What I'm concerned about is what happens when the regulators fail, right? So we have all this regulation. We have regulation on top of regulation on top of regulation, and then we have people at these regulatory agencies that are supposed to execute and perform their job, right? And spend billions of dollars on it. Okay. On the Oversight Committee, I chair the subcommittee on health and financial services, for example. I have had numerous hearings on the baby formula crisis, as an example, and the SVB hearings, as an example, and we'll continue to have more. What I'm seeing is concerning me, and it seems like there's a general theme. If business makes a mistake, and they do, right? We can all point to businesses that fail. What happens? They lose their job, right? People actually get fired. They lose market share. They lose that ugly word called profit. There is a consequence to their action because there is a person that we held accountable. In fact, I think Congress actually put in this law called Sarbanes-Oxley. Are you familiar with that? Which I mean, you want to talk about burdensome regulation. However, what it did was have some accountability, remember? Because it had, my COO or my CFO had to sign their name that if X screwed up, one person was held accountable. What I'm failing to see, and hopefully you can enlighten me and see clearer or more clearly, is I don't see that same concept of accountability on all these regulatory agencies and regulators who run these agencies. I mean, I am yet to find a person at a regulatory agency that will take ownership on the SVB crisis, on the baby formula crisis. That's a concern to me. Yet my colleagues across the other end of the aisle want to give these agencies more money and more power with no accountability. I see that as gravely concerning. So with that, question is to you all, who owns these regulatory agencies, whether it be the FDA, the FAA? If there is an error, whose head do I roll? Anybody?
Congress owns them. Congress created them. Congress funds them.
Wonderful.
Congress provides oversight of them. And the ultimate accountability is the U.S. Congress.
So if I understand you correctly, I could haul in the head of the FDA, which in my opinion, if he's at the top, and Congress could fire that person.
No, you've given the president the authority to run those agencies. Congress.
Okay, so the president could fire them.
Yeah.
How many times has that happened?
I don't know, but we can certainly get back to you with that.
Often? Is that a common? Give me a gut feel. Like usually, I mean, the baby formula crisis, that was a crisis, right? At the SVB bank, major crisis. Yep. Who do you think's going to get fired? I'll take a bet right now. I'll bet the don't pass line. I bet A, we can't even admit there's a problem, and B, we'll probably promote that person. Therein lies the problem. So I'm going to advocate that Congress use the very rules that it enacted for private business that they use for themselves. And there must be more accountability because right now, I think for the American people, Mr. Chairman, there is zero accountability and zero heads roll when there's a crisis. And with that, I thank you and yield back.
I think the gentlelady from Michigan and my colleague and ranking member, I think will be back shortly. I'm going to yield myself some time to give closing remarks, to also give a colleague an opportunity to come and share his thoughts and ask you questions. But first, let me say thank you for your insight and your input and facilitating a good discussion. I said in my remarks that I worked in the Bush administration at the FDIC, an independent regulator. And I must say, there were good people over there, and they were well-intentioned, some good Americans, loved their country. But I was just astonished by the almost unfettered power to basically write the force and effect of law in policies, rules, and even guidance, which sounds so benign, and yet it has the same force and effect of law if you ask those who are being regulated. And so from that perspective, my eyes were opened. I thought to myself many days while serving at the FDIC, and again, proudly along some of my colleagues there, but as an institution, I thought, my goodness, my civics teacher, Miss Becky Taylor, never told me there was a fourth branch of government. And I think it's like the nature of man, there's a nature of these agencies. And whether it's to be relevant or it's to manage risk at a zero basis, which is not real life, unless you can shut a government down and still keep your job. I'm not picking on Mr. Fauci, but to make these calls and that put people literally out of business and they can't provide for their families. Some struggle to come back and still struggle when the decision makers here will get paid regardless of whether the economy's open or not. It's a pretty perverse dynamic to me when people are making those kind of decisions. So we have to have a better process for oversight. And we have to have a better process to determine what things are necessary, what things are appropriate, and how to best strike the balance of providing basic guardrails and then letting the free fellow Americans make the decision about their own lives and the choices for their families. And as my colleague said, no, thank you for your coffee. I'm going down here where they make a bigger cup, a better cup, a cheaper cup, and that competitive force, I think, is a pretty efficient, self-regulating effect on this country. I think we put too little value in the self-regulatory effect of free markets, and we put too much of a premium on this sort of top-down, even, I'll just say this top-down system of micro-regulating every sector of our economy. I took some time to provide some closing remarks, and I've got a colleague, but I want to yield to you, Mr. Boyle, for some closing thoughts and comments, and then we'll have our last member give his questions and comments.
If Chip Roy is really the last speaker at this, I'm aghast, but I will.
Might want to filibuster.
Yeah, I'll speak for the next hour and a half. Wait them out, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we'll switch up the order here and make these closing comments, and then hand it back to you to the remaining speaker we have. I'll just kind of in the same vein you just did, offer several observations or beliefs or both. The first is we are a representative democracy. I believe that the decisions ultimately should be made by the people as expressed through their elected representatives. So the idea that any bureaucrat would in any way overrule the people's wishes as expressed who they elected, I find offensive. And I oppose that, and frankly, there's no red or blue, Republican or Democratic exception to that in my view. The second thing I think is, and even I just use the term bureaucrat, I do object to not that the chairman necessarily did this, but certainly others do, to the common characterization of a government employee, a public servant, as a no-name bureaucrat who is just sitting there attempting to subvert things. I generally find that that is not the case. There have been instances, and I have personally observed a few of them, whether here in Congress or elsewhere, where you will have people behind the scenes who are attempting to subvert the will of those who have been elected, and that is wrong. But we should not use that to paint a broad brush, because the reality is the overwhelming majority of those who work in government are good, hardworking people. Many times they could actually make more in the private sector, but they're doing what they're doing for the good of the public. So I hope that we understand and recognize the complexity when we're talking about this issue. Now, I would also observe, and I think that this has been a real problem of the last 25 years, as Congress has increasingly become hyper-partisan and dysfunctional, We have voluntarily ceded power to the other branches of government. I think that is certainly the case when it comes to the judicial branch, and you can cite decisions that either liberals or conservatives object to, where the judicial branch has overridden laws that were passed. And we all know it is quite difficult to get legislation passed. So the fact that too often, in my view, 9 unelected folks are overriding legislation, that should concern all of us who are small d Democrats. This is also the case that in both Democratic and Republican administrations in recent years, they have been able to step in and take advantage because the Congress has essentially ceded certain powers to the executive. Although I have to say, I observe that happening more in foreign affairs, really, than any other realm. So if we're able to take a step back from the typical day-to-day partisanship and really examine the need for regulation, the need for proper regulation, and the need to balance that with what actually is the legislative intent, we can see that this is a complex issue that requires a balanced and nuanced approach. And certainly if there are concrete ideas coming out of this where we can make the system better, I certainly would be welcome to those. So with that, I'll be happy to yield back and thank the chair.
I thank my ranking member, and will yield to our final speaker and friend and gentleman from Texas, Chip Roy.
Thank the chairman, and I thank the ranking member. Thank you for your indulgence. I was trying to make it back from the House Judiciary Committee, where we were actually just having a thorough debate on the REINS Act and the extent to which we might wish to rein in the regulatory state. And it was a good debate, and it's meritorious here, and that's why I bring it up. One question that I would just like to ask at the beginning of this hearing, and I had to leave to go to Judiciary, there was some discussion among a number of the members about taxes and tax burden and these allegations about the rich not paying their fair share. I assume this has been covered to some degree, but I just want to make sure for purpose of the record, and I think, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, we've worked together in the past in my former staff days, but would you agree that, in the time I've been around the Hill, and I came to the Hill as a staffer in 2003, the top 1% of taxpayers paid 33% of the overall tax burden. 52% was paid by the top 5%. In 2010, that was 37 and 59 respectively. In 2020, after the implementation of the Trump tax plan, 42% of taxes were paid by the top 1%, 62% by the top 5%. Across the entire strata, it has moved up in terms of who's paying the burden. Now, we can debate about what that means in terms of overall income impact, sure, but that's a different question, and this is my actual question, in terms of the revenue. Is it not true that we are at an historic high in terms of revenues to the Treasury, Mr. Holtz-Eakin?
Yes.
And is it true that that has only been matched twice in history, once during World War II, when we had a particular need for revenue, and then again in 2000, at the sort of back end of the dot-com boom? We're around 19.6 to 20% of GDP.
It was about 20% at the end of the dot-com bubble.
And so my question for you is, would you agree then? I mean, we use this line, we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. That's an easy punch, right? That's a political line. But is it not at least true? I mean, we're here in the Budget Committee. I mean, I wish my colleagues were here, and I wish I could have engaged. But we have to at least operate off of a common set of facts in order to determine how we're going to proceed. Is it not at least true, like it's a matter of just simple fact, that in terms of revenue, if we look at the overall economic production of this country, that we're bringing in approximately 20% of it into the Treasury, which is an all-time high. So by definition, it's not just a political line, that if we have if we're out of balance, if we have deficit spending, that it is in fact a spending problem, not a revenue problem.
For me, I think the important issue is going forward. And what I see when you look at every CBO projection is the fact that the spending programs, particularly the large mandatory spending programs, will grow much more rapidly than any revenue source plausibly can. And so if you have a spending growth rate that exceeds the revenue growth rate, the lines just diverge. Now, you can have a one-time tax increase, but you don't change the growth rate of revenue, so you just defer the problem at some level. You've got to deal with the growth rate of those large spending programs and the welfare of their beneficiaries because they are the most important in the social safety net.
Thank you for that. In my limited time, I was going to have Mr. Harris, as a former Biden administration official, I'll just ask a quick question about I think earlier you were talking about the importance of the IRA tax credits and how they'll leverage private investment. I think can we at least just acknowledge for the record that it's going to be significantly high-income earners and corporations who will be the biggest beneficiaries of these tax credits, because 90% of the subsidies are going to billion-dollar corporations, and 80% of the EV subsidies, which are a big portion of what we're talking about, are going to people who make over $100,000 a year as an individual or $300,000 a year as a couple. And I just asked Mr. Harris a pretty quick answer. Is that not true? Is it not true that that's who that's going to?
So I would consider the full economic benefit, including the impact of climate change, which is really...
Well, hold on, but that's not a tax issue. True or false? Are those tax credits going to those corporations? Big billion-dollar corporations, 90%.
They go to a combination of consumers and corporations.
And the consumers getting EVs, are they not making over $100,000 a year or $300,000 as a couple to go buy a Tesla?
So some of the consumer credits for EVs have income limits, so high-income taxpayers cannot claim those.
Right, but the vast majority, 80%, according to every study I've looked at, are going to those people. Look, my point is, we'll go around on this, and I'll use my 5 minutes. I'm not going to go over because out of respect for the time, that those tax subsidies, I hear my Democratic colleagues saying, well, we need tax increases, we need revenues, and we're talking about this debt ceiling debate. Yet the primary driver of what they're trying to do are tax credits and tax subsidies to the wealthiest among us and to the corporations. In this case, tax subsidies to corporations to promote an agenda. As you just said, it's an agenda-driven tax subsidy. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want tax revenue, I give you tax revenue. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I also thank Dr. Holtz-Eakin and Mrs. Harned and Mr. Cruz and Dr. Harris for your time and all the time you took to prepare, and appreciate the conversation and the debate and the input, and we wish you a great rest of the week.